Our guest is Dr. Laurence Broers, the Caucasus Program Director at London-based peace-building organization Conciliation Resources. Thanks for this opportunity. Yerevan and Baku expressed their willingness to sign a peace agreement by the end of the year. Do you think there is a real possibility that will happen?
Well, it's a very unpredictable situation. It's an unprecedented situation. But we do have this commitment from the leaderships in both countries to sign an agreement that would settle certain issues at the interstate level. Now, I think what's interesting is that the international environment is perhaps more conducive to an agreement than it has been in the past. Russia has effectively, declined enormously in terms of its reach and influence. And contrary to some of the analysis that was taking place at the time of the 2020 war, including my own, Western powers have reasserted themselves. And what we see is an EU-mediated process with strong support coming from the United States that both sides appear to be bought into. So whether this can actually arrive at an agreement is very uncertain. I think other factors are very much creating risks, and I think the best that we can do is identify those risks and be prepared for them.
Russia suggests suspending the issue of the Karabakh status. Meanwhile, Armenia and Azerbaijan must try to reconcile. Is this likely a scenario?
Well, I think we do have this very interesting mediation landscape where there are rival proposals on the table, and there is this sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit competitive mediation landscape. But I think all mediators basically face a number of very significant dilemmas. We don't know the content of the proposals that have been discussed, but there is wide speculation that the Russian proposal, as you say, proposes to postpone discussion of the status issue in Nagorno-Karabakh to a mid or long-term future. And I think this illustrates very clearly that Russia's continued influence depends on the non-resolution of the conflict. And I really think it's worth remembering that prior to 2020, there was maybe one moment of consensus between Baku and Yerevan, and that was that they didn't want a mediation process dominated by Russia. And in fact, I think we're seeing this very interesting dynamic where Armenia and Azerbaijan are implicitly, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly edging a Russian monopoly on mediation out of the picture. Now, the European Union, I think, faces a different set of dilemmas. The European Union is working within the framework of Azerbaijani territorial integrity, and its solution or its approach depends on arriving at a viable governance and security solution for the Karabakh Armenians. And it's doing that in the context of a consolidated authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan that is not interested in accepting limitations to its sovereignty. So I think for the European Union, the risk is that it facilitates a peace with certain measures instituted for Karabakh Armenians that may, that there's a risk that is overturned in the future. And that would, of course, hugely discredit the European Union and the Western vector in general. So, I think this is a very interesting situation where, Yerevan and Baku do actually exercise more agency and have more control over what's happening than they have had in the past. Whether this can arrive at a viable and certainly a comprehensive solution to all of the issues that are contested between Armenians and Azerbaijanis is very uncertain.
We don't know the detail, but I guess you think that the package proposed by the US and the European Union assume that Azerbaijan will have sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, that's my understanding. I don't know what is being discussed in the formal proposal, but my sense is that that is the direction. That is my understanding.
Azerbaijan adamantly refuses to discuss the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. In that case, does Armenia have a chance to ensure that the territory will be populated by Armenians and there will be a link between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, I think these are the issues that are being discussed very intensively. We've always said in the peace building practitioner community that one of the missing conversations in this peace process and one of the major reasons for its dysfunctionality is the absence of a dialogue between Baku and Stepanakert. As you mentioned, Azerbaijan has said that it doesn't want to discuss status. But it is being presented with its own dilemma in a way. To arrive at a viable long-term solution that doesn't involve the ethnic cleansing of the population in Nagorno-Karabakh, it needs to have a dialogue with that population, which of course it frames as its own citizens. But due to the securitization and deinstitutionalization of civil society in Azerbaijan since 2014 in particular, we don't see the kinds of individual and organization that could begin to open up a dialogue. How does it sort of get out of this situation? I think there are a number of things that would need to happen to make a dialogue more possible, more plausible between Baku and Stepanakert. The first thing, of course, would be to cease all ceasefire violations. The biggest risk in this whole situation is continued use of coercive bargaining, of ceasefire violations, which just destroys any sense of trust or confidence that builds up. I think there also needs to be a facilitation of a right of return for those Karabakh Armenians that were displaced in 2020. That could be, really an easy, a low-cost option for Azerbaijan to show that it is serious about a relationship with the Armenians of Karabakh. And then I think, there's a wide horizon, there's a whole spectrum of potential confidence-building measures. We've seen some of these instituted in the Georgian context, vis-a-vis Abkhaz and South Ossetians. There are so many things that could be done to provide some kinds of service to Karabakh Armenians. But all of this, it sounds great in the current context of continuing ceasefire violations. And moreover, I would say, an apparent unwillingness to challenge the narrative about Armenia and Armenians in Azerbaijani society. It all reads like fiction. I think we would need to see a much more differentiated approach to different Armenian communities in Azerbaijani discourse, in Azerbaijani narratives. What is taught about Armenians in Azerbaijani schools. We really need a much wider transformation that would enable the kinds of societal reconciliation that are needed if peace is to be sustainable. So still, a very, very long way to go.
But can the dialogue between Azerbaijan and the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh be effective if there are no mediators?
Well, that's a kind of philosophical question about how effective mediation has been throughout this whole story. So I know that the de facto authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh have said that they are ready for dialogue, but only if it is internationally mediated. I think we're at this point where the sides are setting out their initial positions, which are, as ever, incompatible. I would reiterate that the involvement of societal figures, of public figures, of civil society at this point could be essential. in opening up some space, in opening up some back channels. So, I think this is really where we see the cost of the decline and demise of an independent civil society in Azerbaijan. I remember visiting Nagorno-Karabakh with our organizational partner, Avaz Hasanov, back in the early 2000s, and him speaking to students in Stepanakert. Those kinds of figures are very much needed now to open up this dialogue and to rehumanize the relations across the divide, which have been so profoundly dehumanized in recent years. So, yes, mediation can play a role, but it is ultimately Armenians and Azerbaijanis who have to transform this situation.
In addition to peacekeepers, be they Russian or not, are there other mechanisms to ensure security when there is a hatred between peoples?
Well, I think rather than trying to normalize hatred by keeping people secure from it and assuming that hatred, we have to challenge that hatred. So obviously there are very real and legitimate fears of ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. That is what's driving continued commitment to the self-styled Nagorno-Karabakh Defense Army. And this is one of the major concerns that Azerbaijan has, which I think is quite normal for any state. No state wants to see independent, uncontrolled armed forces on its territory. One of the core definitions of statehood is a monopoly on the power to coerce within your sovereign territory. But we're in this, very negative spiral where the securitization of Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, makes people rely on their own capacities and on the defense army to continue to exist. There are solutions and approaches that are being discussed. The conversion of the defense army into a police force. There are all kinds of midterm approach that can be taken to security in these kinds of situations. But for that, you have to have a different discursive rhetorical climate. And I think that's, the change has to come at that level first. And then you can then devise, become more creative in terms of the kinds of security that are relevant on the ground.
Do you think Azerbaijan is going to ask Russia to withdraw its peacekeepers at the end of the term in 2025?
Well, that's $1 million question right now in the South Caucasus, and I guess it will continue to be the case. I've learned not to try to make predictions in this context. Things are extremely unpredictable. But what I would say is that prior to February 24th, that seemed like an unlikely outcome. I would say now it seems much more plausible that the war in Ukraine really has shattered Russia's standing as a security provider in the South Caucasus. And of course, that has knock-on effects, including for its peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. So, I don't know whether Baku will take that decision, but I would see it as much more likely and plausible in the aftermath of the Ukraine war than before.
But we see that Russia has been weakened. Does Putin have any leverage to put pressure on Aliyev? In Sochi, we saw that neither Moscow's nor Yerevan proposals were included in the statement.
I think Russia's leverage overall is in decline. Of course, even a weakened Russia is still a hugely significant and powerful actor in the South Caucasus. But I think, ironically, the factor that could really make a Russian peacekeeping force redundant in Nagorno-Karabakh would be the desecuritization of the relationship between Baku and Stepanakert. So that brings us back to this notion of dialogue between the Azerbaijani state and the Karabakh Armenian population. Of course, if there is an interstate agreement signed by the end of this year, this is also I think, a factor that would contribute to the sense that the peacekeeping mission mandate might not be renewed. But this is an incredibly unpredictable, volatile situation, so it's very difficult to make predictions.
Russia did not condemn Azerbaijan's attack on Armenia, neither did the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Can Armenia hope for any help from the West?
Well, I would say that the attack on Armenia on 13th, 14th of September did attract a very different kind of reaction from Euro-Atlantic powers as compared to the escalations in Lachin and Parukh in Nagorno-Karabakh. We did see, I think, some significant shifts among some actors away from a both-sidist kind of approach to a much clearer, more emphatic defense of the territorial integrity norm, which is ultimately the norm that I think that states do privilege. So I think in that sense, we do see support when it is de jure Armenian territory that is under attack. We also saw, of course, the mobilization of an EU monitoring mission, which is currently being deployed to assist with the demarcation and delimitation of the border. But I think if you're talking about sort of more concrete military aid, I think that's much more uncertain, and I think that's also quite well understood in Armenia. There's been a lot of coverage recently of new arms deals to bolster the country's defensive capacities. Yeah, I mean, I think a certain degree of support where the territorial integrity norm is challenged. But beyond that, I think the question is for Armenia to develop a foreign policy that is appropriate to this multipolar context where we have different poles around the South Caucasus interacting with the region in different ways and with different demands. So I think that's really the challenge today for Armenian foreign policy.
And my question about the corridor, what kind of road Azerbaijan wants?
Yeah, again, I mean, I don't know the concrete details of what is being discussed. In terms of the public debate, the positions are that Azerbaijan appears to want a kind of equivalence of extraterritorial control, that this would, the territory of the road would not be Armenian sovereign territory. So with this element of extraterritoriality and a kind of equivalence, as Azerbaijan sees it, with the Lachin corridor, which is of course not under Azerbaijani control, but under Russian control. And the Armenian position is that this would, of course, be Armenian sovereign territory. And I think, this is also the EU's position. The EU is not necessarily supporting extraterritorial solutions. So, I mean, again, I've said this before, and apologies to listeners who've heard me say this before, but, this whole language of corridors, I find quite dysfunctional. It still assumes that there is enemy territory that you have to pass through, that you need safe passage, and therefore you need special security measures. Now, that might be necessary for a transitional period, but ultimately, if we're really talking about opening up the region, you need freedom of movement and a kind of a total access approach. So, I think the way that we've been talking about these corridors is very much reproducing the insecurity and the conflict narrative. Ultimately, we need to have, Armenians and Azerbaijanis moving around freely across each other's countries. I know that seems a utopian dream today, but if we are serious about the South Caucasus emerging as a viable region, that is what we're talking about.
Thank you again for joining us. Just let me remind that we were speaking with Laurence Broers, the Caucasus Program Director at London-based peacebuilding organization Conciliation Resources. Thank you.